Okay, so you want to own a casino. The house always wins, right? It sounds like a money printer. Build the building, put in the tables, wait. It is not a money printer. You are actually running a trust machine, a machine that needs tens of millions of dollars in licensing and security just to open its doors. And the moment that trust breaks, one bad data leak, one regulatory decision made by a government you don't control, your entire empire can be gone by the afternoon. Here's what nobody tells you about owning a casino. Most people think the house wins because the games are rigged. They're not. The actual math is almost boring. What's not boring is what that math is actually built on. Who has beaten it? What happens to that math the moment the entire building goes quiet for months at a time? And what happens when the government that lets you operate decides it doesn't like how you're operating? By the end of this, you'll understand why the math on the floor almost doesn't matter, why some of the smartest gamblers alive have beaten the house without ever cheating, why the building itself is designed to manipulate you before a single card is dealt, and why an entire industry that survived a 78-day shutdown still lost billions to a single piece of legislation on the other side of the world. Let's start with the part nobody tells you before you've spent a single dollar, what it actually costs to open the doors in the first place. Before a single card gets dealt, you have already paid for permission. In states like New York, initial casino licensing fees alone can run between $20 and $50 million, according to figures from the American Gaming Association. That's not a fine, and it's not a tax. That's the price of being allowed to try. And it doesn't stop once you're approved. Most jurisdictions require ongoing compliance spending, annual license renewals, and ongoing background checks on anyone with a meaningful ownership stake, none of which generates a single dollar of gaming revenue on its own. Then comes the building. The Bellagio, one of the defining casino resorts on the Las Vegas Strip, cost around $1.6 billion to build back in 1998. Nearly a decade later, the Venetian Macau cost roughly $2.4 billion. These aren't outlier numbers for a serious property. They're closer to the entry price. So before you've taken a single bet, you've spent tens of millions on paperwork and over $1 billion on the building itself. And none of that buys you a single dollar of revenue yet. It buys you the right to open the doors and start the clock.
Here's the part that makes this genuinely different from most businesses. Once that clock starts, the math on the floor is almost boring. Most people think a casino wins because the games are stacked. They're not by much. Blackjack can run under a 1% house edge. Roulette sits around 5%. On a single hand, the casino's advantage over you is almost nothing. The casino isn't betting on beating you once. It's betting on beating everyone, thousands of times an hour for years. That's not a rigged game. That's the law of large numbers running at industrial scale. Flip a coin once and anything can happen. Flip it 10 million times and the math always wins. A casino floor is 10 million coin flips happening at the same time every single day, inside a building that cost over $1 billion to build, specifically so those flips never stop. So if the edge is that thin, how does a casino know exactly how much you're worth to it before you've lost a dollar? That free suite you got comped last year wasn't generosity, it was a rebate calculated to the dollar before you sat down. When a pit boss rates you, they're running a formula. Your average bet times how many hands you play per hour times the house edge times how long you stay. That number is called your theoretical loss, what the math says you'll lose over that session, whether you actually lose it or not. Your comps are just a slice of that number handed back to keep you at the table. Even the loyalty math is engineered down to the decimal. Slot club rebates typically sit around 0.2%, meaning it takes about $400 in wagers to earn a single dollar back. On a game that already returns 99%, that generous rebate moves your actual return to roughly 99.25%. It sounds like the casino handed you an edge. It handed you a rounding error. And that rounding error is the entire point. It's calibrated to feel like a gift, while never actually costing the house more than a sliver of what it expected to keep in the first place. Here's what that actually looks like for an ordinary player, not a whale. Say you play $100 a hand for 3 hours at a table with a 1.5% house edge. The math already says the casino expects to keep somewhere around a few $100s of your action before you even sit down. Comp you a steak dinner and a discounted room off that projected number, and the casino has handed back a fraction of a number it already expected to earn, dressed up as a reward for showing up. You feel like a valued guest. The spreadsheet just calls you a predictable one.
Here's the part that breaks the whole house always wins idea completely. A small number of people have actually beaten this formula. Not by luck, by reading it better than the casino did. In 2010 and 2011, 3 Atlantic City casinos were desperate. It was 2 years after the 2008 financial crisis, and high rollers had mostly stopped showing up. Revenue at every major property on the boardwalk was cratering. Into that desperation walked a professional gambler named Don Johnson with a proposal none of them had ever been asked to consider before. He didn't cheat, he didn't count cards, so how did he walk out with $15.1 million? He negotiated. Dealer stands on soft 17, 6 decks instead of 8, aces resplittable, a 20% rebate on any losses over $500,000. Every one of those sounds like a small technical concession. Stacked together, they didn't just shrink the house edge. By Johnson's own account, they brought it down to a fraction of 1% and in his favor. The casinos weren't beaten by luck, they were beaten by executives who approved rule changes without running Johnson's math themselves. It's worth being honest about what this actually required, though. Johnson wasn't playing $5 hands, he was betting up to $100,000 a hand, which meant he needed a bankroll large enough to survive losing sessions along the way without the math ever mattering. This wasn't a trick anyone could walk in and repeat, it was a negotiation available only to someone with both the math skill to know exactly what he was asking for and the capital to survive the swings while the math played out. Within weeks of the story becoming public, all 3 casinos had quietly eliminated those loss rebates for their biggest players. The deal that made Johnson millions closed the moment the executives who approved it finally understood what they'd signed. And Don Johnson isn't even the biggest number in this story. In May of 1995, Kerry reportedly won around $20 million in a single blackjack session at the MGM Grand Prix, enough to visibly dent the casino's earnings that quarter. In the years that followed, some of the same casinos that once fought for his business started quietly capping how much a single player like him could bet, specifically because his swings were volatile enough to threaten a property's quarterly numbers on their own. The house always wins isn't a promise on any given night, it's a statistic over a very, very long run. And on the wrong night, a single whale can move a casino's entire books. But whales cut both ways, and this is where the story turns dark fast. Terrance Watanabe reportedly lost around $127 million gambling at 2 Las Vegas casinos in a single year. He later alleged in court filings that casino staff kept him drinking and betting well past the point where any reasonable person would have been cut off, a claim the casinos disputed. Whatever the truth of that dispute, the incentives underneath it are not in question. The same rating system that calculates your comp also calculates exactly how much value keeping you at the table is worth, and for a whale, that value can run into the tens of millions of dollars a year. For every Don Johnson the casino remembers as a bad week, there's a Watanabe funding the entire VIP program for a decade. The whole high roller economy is a bet that the Watanabes will always outnumber the Packers. Usually they do, and that imbalance is exactly why casinos are willing to comp a suite to anyone willing to sit down and play long enough. Everything so far has happened at a table, but the manipulation doesn't start at the table. It starts the second you walk through the front door. If the games are only slightly in the house's favor, where's the real edge? It's not at the table, it's in the floor plan. Walk into a casino, and the highest margin machines, the slots, are buried deep behind a maze designed to make you walk past everything else first.
Meanwhile, the casino gives away enormous amounts of real estate to things that make almost no direct money at all: buffets, shows, and pools. That's not generosity. Call it the drift. Every hour you spend near the buffet or the pool is another hour you're not spending money at a table, except the whole building is engineered to drift you back toward a machine eventually. It's also why casino floors famously have no clocks and few windows. The goal isn't to trick you into losing track of time so much as to simply remove every free reminder that time is passing at all, so nothing external interrupts the drift. This isn't a shop floor optimized to sell you something in every square foot. It's a maze built around one long, patient walk that keeps ending in front of a screen with a lever. None of this is illegal, and almost none of it is even hidden. Gaming regulators in most jurisdictions are far more focused on how the games themselves are mathematically fair, that the roulette wheel isn't weighted, that the shuffle isn't rigged, than how the building is laid out or how a comp is calculated. The floor plan lives in a regulatory blind spot. Nobody is cheating you out of a fair game. They're just spending an enormous amount of design effort making sure you stay in the room a little longer than you meant to. Everything up to this point assumes the building stays full, the lights stay on, and people keep walking through that maze every single day. In March of 2020, none of that was true anywhere in the world. Here's the part that exposes exactly how fragile the volume assumption really is. On March 17, 2020, Nevada's governor ordered every casino in the state to close. Not slow down, close. For 78 days, the machines that had been running 10 million coin flips a day sat completely silent. The Nevada Gaming Control Board estimated the state's 219 major casinos lost $6.2 billion during that closure, a 25.2% drop from the year before. Nationally, U.S. commercial casino revenue fell 31% for the year, down to $30 billion, the lowest total the industry had seen since 2003. Here's what nobody expected going into it. The lights still had to be paid for, the security systems, the surveillance networks, the loan payments on that billion-dollar building. None of it paused just because the doors were locked. For 78 days, every casino in Nevada was carrying the full weight of a business built for volume with zero volume coming in. The industry that adapted fastest wasn't the one that waited it out. It was the one that found a version of volume the lockdown couldn't touch. Legal sports betting revenue hit an all-time high of $1.5 billion in 2020, up 69% year over year, and online gaming revenue nearly tripled to about $1.6 billion. None of that offset the physical floor's losses completely, but it proved something important. The trust machine could survive, even partially, by moving the bets somewhere the lockdown order couldn't reach. Some buildings never opened their doors again, though. Harrah's Reno, after 83 years in continuous operation, shut down in March 2020 and never reopened. It wasn't the games that killed it. It was 78 days of fixed costs with the doors locked and no equivalent of online volume to fall back on. But most of the industry did something the airline and hotel sectors struggled to do nearly as fast. It came roaring back. Within 3 years, Nevada casinos were posting record revenue. The math that makes a casino profitable, thin edge, massive volume, relentless repetition, is exactly the same math that makes it recover fast once the doors open and the volume returns. The building didn't change. The only thing that mattered was whether people were allowed back inside it.
That's the domestic version of the trust breaks and everything stops. But there's a completely different version of this story, one where an entire industry's revenue model didn't get paused for 78 days, it got legislated out of existence over the course of a decade. In Macau, historically, the biggest casinos didn't even deal with their biggest customers directly. Outside companies called junket operators did, flying in VIP gamblers, comping their travel, and functioning like private banks, lending players money and collecting the debts themselves in exchange for a commission from the casino. Part of the reason junkets existed at all is that gambling debts owed by mainland Chinese players were notoriously difficult to collect across the border directly, so an entire private industry grew up specifically to solve a legal collection problem the casinos themselves couldn't. At their peak, junket-driven play accounted for the large majority of Macau's total gaming revenue, at times reported north of 80% in the industry's biggest years. That's not a side business, that was the business. So what happens when the government that allows this decides it's over? In Macau's 2022 gaming law, junkets can no longer share revenue with casinos at all. They're capped at a flat 1.25% commission, restricted to working with a single operator, and the dedicated VIP rooms that defined the entire industry effectively disappeared. The number of active junket operators went from 235 in 2014 to under 20 within a decade, an entire revenue model built over 3 decades, gutted by one law. Here's what nobody predicted. The casinos didn't collapse with the junkets. At least one major Macau operator ended up giving up a dramatically smaller share of its VIP revenue and commissions than it had before the law changed, while still pulling in strong overall gaming revenue in the years that followed. The middlemen had quietly been capturing more margin than the casinos ever actually needed to give up. The regulation that was supposed to hurt the casinos ended up making at least some of them more profitable per dollar of VIP revenue than they'd been in decades. So what does all of this add up to if you're the one signing the paperwork to own the building? You're not buying a game with a big edge. The edge is almost nothing per hand. You're buying volume, the ability to run that thin edge across thousands of bets an hour for years without it ever stopping, in a building that cost you tens of millions of dollars just to get permission for and well over $1 billion to build. You're buying a comp system engineered to look generous while giving back only a sliver of what it takes in. You're buying a floor plan built to hold people in the building longer than they plan to stay. You're buying exposure to a small number of players smart enough to read your own math better than you do. You're buying a fixed cost structure that keeps running at full weight when the doors are legally forced shut for months at a time. And you're buying a government that can rewrite your entire revenue model with a single piece of legislation, the way Macau just did to an entire industry. The house doesn't always win. The house wins on volume, time, and trust holding. Take away any one of those three, even for 78 days, and the math stops working exactly the way it's supposed to. So if you do decide to buy a casino, understand what you're actually buying. You're not buying a room full of games stacked in your favor. You're buying a machine built on volume, precision-tuned rebates, and a floor plan engineered to hold people a little longer than they meant to stay, running on the assumption that the smart few never outnumber the many, that the doors never stay locked for long, and that the government letting you operate never changes its mind. Picture the version of this that actually works: a full floor, every seat rated, every comp calculated down to the cent, the building doing exactly what $1 billion of concrete and a decade of licensing paperwork was built to do. Most nights, that's exactly what happens. The nights and the years it doesn't are the ones that make the news. If a casino runs on trust the way a bank does, you already know what happens when that trust breaks fast. Watch that one next.